Before we begin, a couple of very, very brief announcements from my side. I don't know if anyone in the room is a neuroscientist or not, and it's sort of like an AA meeting. For those of you who may be neuroscientists, raise your hand. It's good enough. Be proud. You can be proud. Get that hand up there. Number two, the reason I asked that question is that much of this talk will involve contemporary neuroscience and the products of neuroscience, something called neurotechnologies. I may slip into jargon. I will try very hard not to. I'll try to explain these types of neuroscientific techniques and technologies in as generalist a view as I possibly can to make them palatable. In part because I think one of the things that can very easily happen is that when we see these technologies and we hear about this kind of stuff, we are somewhat overcome with something I've referred to as neuroubiquity. And you really can't open a newspaper these days or turn on the television without seeing images the type I'm about to show you. I want to cut through some of the hype that goes with this, what I also refer to as neurohype or neurolalia, neurobabble, what my colleague Roger Scruton at the University of Edinburgh refers to as neuro-nonsense. And he has a much better English accent than I do. I rally against neuro-nonsense, but I think it's very important that we not throw away the proverbial baby with the bathwater. There is some neuroreality here. And more than the neuroreality is the frightening reality of the fact that we, as a public, as individuals, perhaps as whole societies, communities, and even body politic, like the latest and greatest science and technology because it provides great leverage and purchase to do certain things we want to do, for certain insights that we may want. And so the fear may not be against neuro-nonsense. It's about the misinterpretation and potential misuse or inapt use of the neurorealities that are there and an overexpansion, embellishment, or perhaps even ampliative claim of what it can and cannot do. The third point I'd like to make is that this is not a speech impediment. This is a New York City accent. By way of Bavaria, and so the combination of the two things coming together make me completely incomprehensible to any of you. And so if my accents bother you at any point, you can't understand them, just raise a hand and go, I don't get it. And I'll try to help and change, but I'll do the best I can. So with that, let's launch into this discussion today. If we're actually looking at the idea of predictive neuroscience, there's a sniff of this that goes along with ideas like Minority Report. That's science fiction. It's science fiction that exists on the cusp of our realities based upon the possibility of some trajectory. I'm very happy to come before you and say that one of the things I have the great pleasure of doing is working with an organization called SEE, the Science and Entertainment Exchange of the National Academies of Science that does an awful lot of work with the Directors Guild of America. In turn, what I really do is I provide insight and some information to science fiction writers, screenwriters, playwriters, authors. The idea is to base as much of that science fiction as we can on science fact that we have today, so as to predict reliably what that might look like 10, 20, 30 years in the future. That's great fun for me because what it allows me to do is take out the stops. This lecture is all about putting the stops back in. But before we move into the realm of science fiction, what's very important for you to understand is that the call for us to utilize the neuroscientific acumen, techniques, and technologies we have, and those perhaps that we may develop, is not necessarily simply generated by the engine of curiosity of science and engineering. There are a few words that I want you to be very workingly familiar with throughout this lecture. Words like 9/11, terrorism, Columbine, Oslo, Phoenix, Aurora, Colorado, Newtown, Sandy Hook, Connecticut. These are sentinel events that prompt a call from the general public and increasingly from local governments, state governments, and increasingly from national governments, and not only in this country but worldwide, for science and technology to do something. I stand before you as exemplar. After events like this happen, our offices deluge with calls from the media, from the public. Why can't you, as a neuroscientist, do something? Why can't we use the power of the science and technology that we have in our hands to be able to thwart this threat to our public safety, to our children, to our elders, to our populations, writ both small and writ large? Can't you predict this? And of course, the trajectory that goes along with that is, if you can predict it, can we not then provide viable targets, not only for assessment, but for access, targeting, and intervention? The answer there is, well, what can we do? What can't we do? And what should we do about everything in between? Indeed, what we know is that this field, neuroscience, is somewhat nascent. I came into the field 33 years ago. And 33 years ago, there were only a handful of programs that were actually dedicated to the field as such. The titular field of neuroscience literally came together by a concatenation of the natural sciences, anatomy, physiology, chemistry, pharmacology, behavioral science, but increasingly gained momentum to become what we now see as a convergent or a consilient field that brings together physics, engineering, the social sciences, and increasingly the humanities. What neuroscience has done is addressed long-standing questions that philosophy, theology, anthropology, and sociology have poised about what it means to be, the nature of free will, the nature of the self, self-other relationships, the whole question of what is the mind. And in fact has used those as hallmark features to address the focus of this science to ever more deeply probe into these questions. What neuroscience has successfully done is bring these disciplines together, indeed, to create a deeper understanding of the structure and function of nerves, and by extension, the brain, and perhaps this thing that it does is in some way to instantiate this effect that we know as consciousness, cognition, emotions, actions that we call mind. And as you see before you on the screen, this represents about 120 years of representation of what neuroscience has been, from anatomical drawings post-mortem to the use of increasingly sophisticated imaging devices, to the coupling of imaging devices with those devices that are able to both feed back onto the brain and in some ways not only measure but also control. So in a span of 120 years, what neuroscience has done is made these ardent strides by linking tools that it has at its capabilities with an expansive theoretical body. And this expansive theoretical body has been such that it's used these types of heuristics, what the neuroscientist and philosopher Gerd Gigerenzer has referred to as tools to theory, theory to tools heuristics. Now, let me explain very briefly. What we have done is we've developed particular tools that were at our disposal. The scientific method, as you heard earlier, the standard tools that we use anatomically, biochemically, in molecular biology. And as a consequence, we've focused those tools, that knowledge, that existing rationality, on what we understand about brains, minds, and individuals and organisms that have them. As a consequence of that, what we've done is expanded that theory. And with expanded theory, we now develop new tools, more sophisticated tools, that then allow us greater purchase, or at very, very least leverage, to embellish even further and feed back and create larger theories, different theories. And in the spirit of science, what we do is we recognize that neuroscience, like any science, must remain self-critical and self-revisionist. Else, it's at least anachronistic and, I think more importantly, becomes dogmatic. What this is all about is what neuroscience can really tell us. So what is important for those of us who do neuroscience and who advocate the use of neuroscience in an ever-widening public sphere of medicine, daily life, and increasingly international relations, national security, defense, and intelligence, is that it requires a pragmatic evaluation of what the science really delivers, what the tools of that science are actually capable of doing, and not a misperception, a miscommunication of either. And then obviously from this level of pragmatic evaluation, develop a sense of prudence with ways we regard and will use the science and its technology in its various applications let loose into the Pandora's box of the social milieu. This feeds us back to the urgings of the public with regard to Columbine, Oslo, Phoenix. The question here is, can't you do something? Can't you figure this out? Perhaps we can use the power of this neuroscientific technique and technology to be able to intuit who might be along those particular lines of transcending those boundaries that we have with regard to social normality, social norms, social aggressiveness, social deviance, violence, and harm? Well, there are a host of potential neuroscientific techniques and technologies that may be candidate for these types of interventions of assessment and potentially access. And this is what we'll talk about. And this is just the sort of short list. Certainly we can go further down the rabbit hole in each one of these, and what I'll do is I'll provide you a brief description of each, just so that you become workingly familiar mostly with their strengths, capabilities, and limitations. What we see is we have things like computerized tomography, a derivation of X-ray, of röntgenography, using a similar form of derivatized technology which engages positron emissions that are based upon the injection or introduction of a particular chemical that then has a rate of decay that we can measure primarily by looking at the metabolic effect in the brain is positron emission tomography. A somewhat related but a bit more complicated type of imaging is something called SPECT, single photon emission computerized tomography. It too utilizes tomographic X-ray type analysis, but it's looking at the decay of a particular molecule, and as a result that it shoots off a photon, and the spin of that photon is then available for us to assess. This too provides a very nice image of some of the molecular activities and chemical activities within the brain. We can get wonderful pictures of the structure of the brain utilizing as low as 1.5 magnetic Tesla magnetic resonance imaging. Beautiful anatomical drawings of the brain are actually reproduced in real time, in real life, utilizing MR. We've seen these incredibly good structural images. When we then couple magnetic resonance imaging to the idea of looking at a paramagnetic signal of blood flow that looks at hemoglobin that is oxygenated versus non-oxygenated, we get this beast, which is functional magnetic resonance imaging, which creates very, very pretty images through a bit of technology and a bit of art, which we'll see in a moment. And we can also couple this to something called DTI, diffuser tensor imaging, which utilizes an image that is based upon the magnetic and paramagnetic spin of water molecules to be able to trace white matter rather than gray matter, which is very useful in our being able to elucidate, illustrate, and depict tracts in the brain. You know, if we couple all of these together, we get a very nice toolkit that allows some very sophisticated imaging, which in many ways delimits some of the spatial constraints or some of the temporal constraints that each one of these imaging technologies, when used individually, may render. We can also couple these to more physiologically based techniques, such as the areas of electroencephalography, basic electroencephalography, which looks at the electrical activity of the brain, and we can then couple that to quantitative electroencephalography or magnetoencephalography, which we'll learn about in a moment. It actually sharpens the tip of that proverbial pencil, increases the acuity of the electroencephalographic lens via sophistication of the techniques that are used. And what we can also do is utilize other forms of investigation that are a bit more predictive and not just descriptive. We can advance the project, the emphasis of the human genome agenda, and we can dig down to the toolkit of molecular biology, genetics, and proteomics. We can apply that to the genome and genetics of the nervous system to develop this field and these approaches, which are called neurogenomic, neurogenetic, and neuroproteomic screening. Let's take a little trip into what each one of these things are doing, but before we do, let's set the stage. The stage is set to be able to provide a general groundwork of what we're trying to do through the use of this neuroscientific technique and technology. And it's basically these two large domains of effect. The first is we're looking at technologically enabled imaging of the living brain. The second is we're looking at neurogenetics and neurogenomics to have something of a predictive inference about what a genome, what's one's genetic composition and protein composition may tell us about not only who you are, but particular susceptibilities, if not dispositions, to what you might be. And of course, each and all of these technologies is viable only if they are yoked to large-scale computational systems that increase the statistical power by which we can develop comparisons, set standards, and then create what's called downward norming, which I'll explain to you in a moment. So just by looking at this, what we're really seeing is that there's a fusion of techniques and technologies that become interrelated. And it's this interrelation, this convergence, that creates great potential power. Potential power. Let's not take that out of context. There's great potential here. I'm sure people might think I had great potential to play in the NBA. At 66 inches, that potential is not realized. I can do other things rather well. I can dribble a basketball pretty well, but I'm not going to be a great shot in the NBA against somebody who stands 6'10", for a number of reasons. I'm going to get stuffed. The question is, are the limitations that exist here sufficient to stuff this, or do we just take this out of the NBA and use it in a different league, so to speak? Because what these techniques will in fact do, what they can do, is many of the things they were intended for. They do provide correlations between anatomy and physiology. They do provide particular insights to individual populational variations, predispositions. And they actually will provide individual trajectories of expression if they are linked across the lifespan. As with any set of data, I can look at your medical records, for example, if I had them at my disposal, from birth until your age now at 29, and you can pay me later. And what we could do is I could say, well, I'm able to get some patterns out of this. And the more sophisticated types of analytics that I'm able to use, whether it's pen and pencil analytics in the old days when I went to school, and that's the kind of statistics we used, or the great computational horsepower that we're now able to bring together through multiple forms of cyber technology, might be able for me to really have some predictive inferences, not only about what happened to her and what that means for her particular presence, but where she might be going, at very least to chart potential or possible paths about what this might mean, and then keep a finger on the pulse of that proverbially to say, well, which way is she going? And might we also be able to mitigate those things? So the reality of what these neuroscientific techniques and technologies are intended to do and the way they are being employed is not, in fact, inapt. This is indeed the toolkit that we have and the tasks that are faced by this toolkit and for which this toolkit is employed. But like any tool, for example, a pen, I recognize that it can be used to do certain things. I can unscrew it and I can write with it. I can write pretty things, I can write obscenities with it. If I were creative enough, I might be able to write great poetry with this. If I was really creative, I might be able to draw with it. I could also perhaps use it a la MacGyver, to chip away at things and do sculpting. Or I could use it to get into a key, into a lock. I came from New York City, I should be able to break any lock is what people think. And so it depends on not only the tool itself, but on the user. Now there are some things this cannot do. I simply can't use this, for example, as a long-range dart. I might think I could, but I can't. I can't literally let this go on the ocean and think that it'll float away and provide somebody with a message of who I am or what I am. That's fairy tale. It's important for us when we take a look at the power of such technologies to recognize what is the wheat and what is the chaff. It's also important for us to look at ourselves through the lens of these technologies and use this as a mirror on what we have done throughout history with those sciences and technology we've had at our disposal so as to not make the same mistakes twice. So let's take a look at some of these technologies and what they really do. This wonderful image is brought to you via the technology of positron emission tomography. As we discussed earlier, it's actually a form of X-ray based analysis that utilizes the emission of a particular nuclear particle called a positron. As that then decays, we're then able to sense that, and what this then allows us to do quite well with this level of accuracy is to assess the local identification of metabolic activity in the brain, characteristically by looking at one of the more viable metabolic molecules, an isotopic form of glucose. What we then do is we use a form of spectroscopic analysis and conversion, and this is a form of spectrophotoscopy. What we then do is we color code these things so that red represents very, very high activity and blue tends to represent very, very low activity. You see these images all the time in a variety of public documents. Certainly the scientific literature is ripe with these. What we've seen is a tremendous, almost 1,000-fold increase in the use of neuroimaging within the scientific literature, and not just the scientific literature, increasingly the social science literature and the humanities literature. And that couples an uptake of these types of sophisticated neurotechnologies to be able to deliver at least some level of validation that there's a structure-function relationship. Here's a real quick little word for you about this. The brain is not really color-coded for easy ID. There aren't really red neurons and blue neurons and red networks and blue networks. We do this. For those of you who are old enough to remember that TV show from the 1960s, no one in the room, this is like the outer limits. We control the vertical. We control the horizontal. We control the spectroscopic depiction of what represents signal and what represents noise. Now, granted, obviously we're doing this through the use of some rather sophisticated statistical parametric programs by which we're able to convert what is in fact a numerical display into this wonderful image. But this is the point where skill, knowledge, technique, and art sort of come together to create this type of wonderful graphic display of what's going on in a living brain. Once again, we set the thresholds. We set the limits. There is some malleability that goes along with this. A more sophisticated form of this utilizes the emission of a single photon, which is then emitted as a consequence of local biochemical activity, and this is then matched or mapped to an ongoing map, an ongoing image that was derived by fixed magnetic resonance imaging to provide a set of coordinates that are referred to as Talairac coordinates. So what we're really doing is we're fitting a photo onto a map, and that's what this does. And what we see is we have very, very sophisticated images that allow for us a good indication of cerebral blood flow. Cerebral blood flow being one step off of an identifier for cerebral metabolic activity. The paradigm here is pretty simple. If I'm a neuron, a nerve cell, or if I'm one of the accessory cells that are equally communicative in the brain called a glial cell, and I'm active, I need oxygen. I need blood. I will utilize the substrate of sugar, glucose. This is detectable utilizing this particular technology. And so what we see is this technology provides for us an indication of what brain areas are relatively active during particular tasks of cognition, of emotion, of behavior, of prediction, of cogitation about future events, etc. We then have this, and this for a long time represented de rigueur in neuroimaging. This is functional magnetic resonance imaging, the proverbial fMRI, and what you see before you is a functional magnetic resonance image of the brain. The top of that image is the front of the brain, the back of that image is the rear of the brain. So this is someone who's laying sort of on their back looking up. And what we use is serial slices that are computationally derived via a rotating magnet, which is then able to develop differential spin of the intrinsic molecules that are present in the brain and be able to sense the different paramagnetic activity of oxygenated hemoglobin versus non-oxygenated hemoglobin. It really represents a very sophisticated form of what you just saw before with SPECT. It too senses metabolic activity in the brain, and it provides a very, very nice depiction of regional activity based upon oxygen demand of various brain levels, sites, networks. It uses something called blood oxygen level demand, BOLD, and this is an image of the BOLD-based signal. One of the criticisms of this has always been, for those of us who do this, and I'm one of them, is that this is really an indirect measure. And for those of us who do this, we recognize that this is an indirect measure, and that's taken into accord when one is making particular conclusions, outcomes, and even predictions of what this means. The running adage in neuroscience, a colloquialism, is that this is really a measure of vein, not brain. It measures blood flow. It's also temporally different than the way the brain really acts. There's a lag, a time lag here. And the time lag here has been as much as 7 to 17 seconds. In neurological terms, that's a long time. So what we're seeing is that, yes, this is very specific, and we love these kind of pictures, and you've seen these. Really, it's not even just the scientific literature. You've seen these in the general media. This is your brain on drugs. This is the brain of the addict. This is your brain about to buy a new Porsche. This is your brain in love. This is your brain drinking bourbon. Granted, this is, a couple of steps removed, a viable thumbnail sketch of local regional activity, of viable cerebrovascular flow in the brain as a consequence of network activation. That's a $25,000 explanation that I just gave you. But Here too, it is us, the neuroscientists, working with the bioengineers and the technicians who have to set the discrimination threshold of what is signal and what is noise. And in fact, what we know is that to be able to get images that look this clean, that look this specific, that have this high level of representative pixelation, we have to tighten up that Gaussian distribution pretty tightly. And it may very well be that we're missing certain things. We have to parse them out as noise, and that noise floor may actually be what the signal is all about. Is this valid? Sure. Does it have value? Absolutely. Is it universal value and universal validity? No, it is not. If we couple it to this type of imaging, diffuse retention imaging, which actually looks at differential spin, magnetic spin of water molecules, primarily in white matter tracts, which are the pathways of the brain, we get an image that looks like this. I think this is artistically beautiful. I just like to put this up on my wall at home. I think it'd make a great neon sign. You know, it's like, this is your brain. Come and get it scanned. And so the issue here is what we're really looking at is differential activity in tracts that can be nicely related to that. If we use the two of these together, we get a very, very nice image of activity in local regions and the differential time and spatial orientation of those pathways that link one brain region to another. So we may begin to dissect out a little bit of the spatiotemporal phenomenology of what's happening in the brain. This too, however, is limited by the same constraint that I spoke to you about earlier. We set the thresholds. We compensate some of these thresholds by using one or more of these technologies in tandem, in triplicate, or in quadruplicate. Obviously, the more tools I'm using, the more specific I can be with my tools, which then brings us to overcoming some of the temporal restraints that we have on imaging through the use of a form of electroencephalography that has become increasingly sophisticated over the past 15 years. State of the art, sort of, right now, represents these two iterations, quantitative and magnetoencephalography, that essentially measure rather weak magnetic differences and fields that are generated by various neural networks, primarily from the superficial layers of the brain, and then also are able to then discriminate particular ionic current fields of the brain, very much like you're seeing here in this cartoon diagram. So what you're really doing with this is you're sort of putting a magnetic microphone into various areas of a stadium and trying to record different people cheering in accordance with different events. Do you get specific voices? Do you really hear what they're cheering about? No. But you get a pretty good representation of where in that stadium people are cheering, how loud they're cheering, and you can then couple that to what's going on the field through this, and what you then say is, I have a nice mix. And of course, the beauty of that is, rather than a fixed snapshot in time, as we're getting here, this is sort of a real-time assessment. So it overcomes some of the temporal parameters, but of course, as you see here, given the weakness of these signals, there are some spatial ambiguities that go along with EEG. Once again, if we couple the technologies, we sort of compensate, we delimit some of these problems. And what we can do is we can then take this and allow a spectral representation as a graphic, which you see here, what's called a partially tessellated image. So I can actually then convert these types of signals to a very, very nice map, and this is an MEG-based map of where things are occurring in real time. Now, let's put all these things together. What I can then do is I can obviously link my neuroimaging together with my forms of EEG. As you can see, I'm generating horsepower here. That's like me coming into your house and saying, well, you know, there's something wrong with your plumbing, and I come in with just a wrench. You know, well, what are you going to do with that? Well, I'm going to fix your plumbing. Yeah, but the plumbing exists in a cabinet, and there are a variety of different pipes. So what I do is I take out my whole toolkit, and I use one size wrench with another and a screwdriver, and I also want to use a hammer to disassemble part of the cabinetry, and then I want to make sure that I have my viable pipe thread. All of these things, if we put together, delimit our capacity to utilize certain tools. They are depictive tools. They show the here and now. Remember the question of do something. The question of do something really gets down to the issue of, well, if I just have these type of neuroimaging tools, I'm going to have to get somebody into the scanner on a pretty regular basis. Go for your daily scan, see how your brain looks today, and then go about your business. There are some real limitations to that. Practical limitations, ethical limitations, and certainly legal limitations to that. Despite the fact that our daily privacy is increasingly being engaged by a variety of surveillance methods, this is not something most people are comfortable with, sort of leaving the house and getting a neuroscan to see what's going on in your head that day. However, this area of neuroscience and technology may narrow the field a bit. What it does is it utilizes populational genomes, individual genomes, and individual genetics to be able to determine or at least describe not only what you are, but what that might become based upon our understanding of the way genomics, population genetics, deal with individual genetics. Individual genetics interact with various environments and set up predispositions who may be vulnerable. We're using this widely in clinical medicine, for example, to be able to predict the likelihood of what's called disease trajectories, or a more sophisticated term is what we call diatheses, potential dispositions that may render certain individuals or whole populations or communities in the vulnerability zone, so as to then intervene appropriately and then divert them away from those environmental events that may be viable triggers. The same construct can be then used when looking at a general population. And in fact, what this then does is identifies a host of these factors, genetics and genomics, targeting particular genetic sequence that may be involved, that are participatory. I'm not advocating that these infer causality. They participate in certain disorders, conditions, and states. And of course, what this also does is this takes a look at the existing genetic structure of you right now, which can be then changed across time. It also looks at various forms of your protein expression to see where you might be on this expression curve, if you will. This is not science fiction either. In fact, there's a great popularity that goes along with this. Does anyone in the room know what a spit party is? Have you ever heard of this? Have you ever heard of an organization called 23andMe? And this is not advocacy for 23andMe at all. I think it's an interesting dynamic. What these types of effects, what these types of organizations are doing, are essentially trying to utilize human genome and your individual genetics as thumbnail sketches of who you are and who you should get along with. 23andMe is a wonderful little organization. You spit into a test tube, you send it off, and it comes back with a genetic analysis of who you are. It's sort of like a nice way of doing heredity planning. What is your genome? What is your genome history? What is your current genetics? And then it also provides for you some indicators about what that genetics might mean in terms of your behavior, your activity, etc. We take that one step further, and then you go to a spit party. And what a spit party is very simple. I spit into a little thing, send it off, spits into a little thing, she spits into a little thing, she spits into a little thing, and then we all come together for a spit party because we've gotten the results back of our human genome and our individual genetics and individual proteomics and phenotypics, and there are certain sets of characteristics that are tightly associated with these genomics, genetics, and phenotypics that are then representative to a color-coded badge that they give me. And I have a little legend that says that if my badge, for example, is, let's say, black, and her badge is green, and her badge is gray, I get along very well with grays and greens, but I should not go anywhere near, like, reds, blues, or oranges. So I go to this party, and then I recognize, well, no, yeah, okay. So what it's sort of doing is it's sort of vectoring me into the new level of neurogenomics eugenics. Because implicitly, what's the message there is that we're going to mate. And so that's going to make for not only wonderful coupling in terms of Match.com meets molecular biology, but hopefully what we'll be able to do is utilize the integrity of our respective genomes, bring them together, and give forth a whole future generation of wonderful little, F1, F2, and F3 series.
That makes me very uncomfortable.
It makes a lot of people very uncomfortable. But interestingly, if you're beginning to look at some of the statistics, at least the statistics we see from an objective standpoint, you know, the initial subjective reaction, and there may of course be a bit of a placebo effect there, is that people say that, yeah, this is, it really, there is something going along with this. Now, it may be something as simple as a biological attraction that is then based upon what's called human lymphocytic antigens, cell surface compatibility factors that we use as sort of initial magnet, if you will, to either attract us to certain individuals or not. And just tongue-in-cheek, as a bracket aside, for those of you who are watching at home, you can try this. One of the things you might be able to do to sort of get around that and do a simple version of this on your own is we're very attuned to the way our brains respond to these lymphocytic antigens, particularly those that are expressed on the skin. And one way to do it is to see if you have what's called protein compatibility. We could get around this whole thing simply by going up to someone at a party and licking them. And then taking a sniff, and if that is in any way appealing to you, there you go. That's a first step indication. Science marches on. But still, the idea of utilizing genomics and genetics as something predictive gets us into this hierarchy. This hierarchy tells us that what we're really looking at is the fact that environments interact with genetics. And by interacting with genetics, they help to express the phenotypes of not only what we are, but what we will become, how our brain develops, and how that brain, in developing, then allows for these predispositions for our sensations, perceptions, cognitions, emotions, and behaviors. So what we see is that, in fact, we can sort of work around some of this. Does this work? Oh, there we go. We can work around looking at genotypes as a possible predictor or indicator of what these phenotypes, the physical expression of nervous systems, brains, and the embodied organism that has one of these is, to determine structure and function that then give us some indication of the body-brain-mind relationship that then work in physical sensations, perceptions, cognitions, behaviors, and these then feed out to a variety of internal and external environments. So these can be used predictively to say if we understand this area, it may help us to understand what we see here through our neuroimaging and our EEG work. And this provides us with a pretty good thumbnail sketch of not only what this is, but what this might become relative to sensations, perceptions, cognitions, behaviors, and their effects in various environments. You see where this is going? Could we, in fact, utilize these things taken alone or together to predict not only what someone is, but what they could become? So one of the things we're looking for is that this may be the key that allows us to then say, well, not only can I use imaging of what you are or what you've been, but how do these structural and functional things fit in to possible pathways forward, if you will, sort of arrow shots into what this might mean of you might turn into, how you might act, what you might do. And in this way, does this solidify what we've got at our hands here? Does this increase not only the statistical power, but the social gravitas of being able to make a prediction that says this individual has these predispositions for very strange behavior that I can then map onto other individuals who've had similar characteristics in various circumstances, and as a result, I can be predictive. And that allows me at some point to at least watch this person, if not intervene. Particularly if I set a line in the sand and say, well, once this guy does this, we're going to get him. Now, the pros of this are clearly that these types of things may be predictive, and in their predictive power may be prophylactic. They may be preventive when used as I just said. Look, every coin has two faces. The second face is that this obviously becomes very stigmatizing. He can say, I'm perfectly fine. I haven't done anything yet. Yeah, but you will. What do you mean I will? I haven't done anything yet. Yes, but by this brain structure that we're evidencing through neuroimaging and through this particular genotype, and you're expressing these particular proteins right now, pal, you're on the slippery slope. I haven't heard a soul. What am I doing? It also goes along with the idea of partial knowledge. Do we really know what information at this level means for us at this level, absent how we can predict or affect various environments? The answer is no. That doesn't mean, however, we're not on the road to doing that. What you see here is a node edge technogram. This is one of the things that our group is working very, very diligently to try to tease apart. Taken individually, neuroimaging in all of its various forms, electroencephalography in all of its iterations, neurogenomics, neurogenetics, neurophenotypics, and proteomics, they have some power, but they have limitations. I can delimit that and increase the power and potential by linking them with other approaches that utilize a host of distinct techniques and technologies to essentially fill in the gaps. And this is what this technogram looks like. It looks at populational and individual genomics, that it then links to individual expressions of genes, genetics, that it can link to anatomy structurally by virtue of functional imaging, which it can then assess in real time at various points by chemical biomarkers. It can link that to pre-existing behaviors of an individual as well as perhaps other individuals who show similar characteristics of genomics, genetics, anatomy, and biomarkers. And then it looks at various social dynamic traits, how this individual exerts these behaviors in comparison to others who express these characteristics or others with regard to their social interactions, inclusive, for example, of monitoring much of their output. Their output, you say? Yes, absolutely. Do I have it on me, my extended lobe? I do. Look, this is my extended lobe, as my wife refers to it. You've all seen one of these little gizmos, haven't you? Absolutely. This has really become the way of information sharing for the 21st century. And we send texts and emails and tweets, and all of these things go into what's known as a signal noise floor, which is, in fact, accessible and accessible. Now, one of the things we can do is we can actually take a look at not only social behavior, but social dynamics by doing something called a cladistic analysis of the way individuals use certain terms within their tweets, their emails, their expressions. And what that helps me to do is to plot along a particular trajectory. Oh, come on. You know this. When you're speaking to someone and you like them, you're using words such as you, they, us. When suddenly they start to piss you off, now it's me, you. Not only are you using those types of words, but you're using words such as don't, never, always. You've seen that. For those of you who had children or ever were one, you know exactly how your verbiage changes when you get pissed off or when you're planning something. And interestingly, one of the things we can do is we can utilize a form of computational analysis based upon neural networking to try to get greater insight into how these things all play together. It's not only the nodes, it's what we call the edges in this technogram that then becomes a socio-behaviorogram. How do we do it? Well, obviously this takes great computing power, and this is what we call the NeuroCyber Fusion. Each and all of these neurotechnologies and neuroscientific approaches have really gained chops, if you will, value, validity, via computational interfacing that allows us to take data across the lifespan at various time points and give us what we call point data that are at any one given point an aggregate of all those data that have come before. So essentially what we're looking at here is birth to grave type data, a host of different data, medical records, behavioral records, criminal records, minor infractions of code in school, at work, etc. All of these feeding into a large-scale data bank that we can then in some way, through our integrative use of technological capability, put into this somewhere and link those types of data to things like neuroanatomical data, neurophysiological data, genomic data for an individual. This is what we call point aggregate data. And what I can do is I can take this point and I can plot it, not only as to where you might be right now, but as to where the arrows might go in terms of viabilities and probabilities, basing a form of, it's called Bayesian versus non-Bayesian statistical probabilistic analysis as to where you might go. Then what I do is I fit that into this, which is a populational funnel. So I take these individual data across life and time span, and I compare them upward to cohort data of people who sort of have the same genomics, genetics, phenotypics, behavioral data just as I do. Once again, amassed, aggregated, assimilated, and synthesized by a great computational power, which is certainly at our fingertips by virtue of cloud computing. And then I can bring that all the way up to whole populational data as a comparison. Working upward, I'm comparative. Working downward, I'm normative. This is what a normal population of individuals looks like, behaves like, does, will do. This is what a cohort of individuals who have your characteristic looks like, behaves like, and probably will do. And then I bring this down to you, and I say, well, now I think I have a pretty good idea probabilistically of where your arrows might go. So we can see what this does. It allows me to then plot not only what you are right now, but your potential trajectories of effect along this thing, which is called a spectrum effect, which is that it's your genotype, your phenotype in various environments that I then aggregate computationally and say, well, at some point, you're going to cross this decisional threshold. You're going to cross the threshold of you're going to be socially violent. You're going to be socially aggressive. You're going to have this disorder, this condition, and do these things. Why? Because there is a probabilistic inference based upon these multiple sources of data that strongly suggest a high correlation of moving in these directions. And the closer you get to here, the more I can say that X, Y, or Z behaviors, activities, etc., are going to be strongly supportive and indicative of you going over this proverbial tipping point. I hate that word, but I'll use it appropriately here. So, what are we really doing? Where are we right now? I'll tell you. What we're trying to do is we're trying to identify brain structure and activity, and in so doing, relate that to all of these dynamics that I've just illustrated for you. What's going on in your brain, what's going on with the structures of the brain, how those structures of the brain may be normal or abnormal by a set of criteria and definition that are established by comparing it to large and small scale data banks of populations and perhaps individuals who have many of the same characteristics as you do. Combining that with analysis of your behavior and some predictive inference, and in doing that, linking brain states to cognitions, emotions, and behaviors, and then utilizing that to scan brains and, in fact, read minds, proverbially, and then actually take that one step further and say what we're doing is we're predicting cognitions, emotions, and behaviors. Even absent the fact that we may understand that scanning brains is not the same as reading minds, what we're able to do is literally hop jump this step by saying scanning brains, when coupled with the rest of this type of information, may give us the necessary and sufficient, he says quizzically, one eyebrow raised, data to be able to make predictions that allow us not only to define, but in some cases to describe to the point of prompting intervention. Well, this illustrates for us a number of tensions that exist in the field and as the field sits nested squarely as an aspect of human endeavor in society. This is what we're faced with right now. One of the things that is driving this is something that we've referred to as the mechanistic paradox. We, particularly in the West, fall victim to this quite often. We don't believe that something works until we explain how it works. Even if we have only a partial knowledge of how it works. We like this. Why? Homo sapiens, it's part of our nature, if you will. We create these explanatory stories. And for a long time, they're myths, and then we develop some theories, and then myth becomes logos. Myth becomes rationalization. We do it all the time. What is thunder? That's the god Thor riding across the sky in his chariots. Why? Because thunder scared us. So we have to explain it. We do this often. This is the nature of science. We start out with some explanatory idea that's hypothetical, and then what we do is we chip away at it through truths that we revise over time. But not only do we fall victim to this mechanistic paradox, once we explain it, it seems that there's a compelling drive to use it. Tools to theory, theory to tools. If those tools are knowledge tools, explanatory tools, at that point we then have a theory. That theory provides grounds and justification for us to then use these things. This is what the philosopher Hans Lenk and the philosopher Hans Jonas refer to as the technological imperative. It's sort of science's version of Field of Dreams. It's like, if you build it, they will come. If you can build it, build it. If you build it, use it. It's a technical push, if you will, that's based upon curiosity, creativity, innovation, coupled to a very, very strong social pull. Do something. Fix the Columbines. Fix the Newtowns. Fix the Oslos. And very often what we find is that this is predicated, at least in part, on something we refer to as Anselm's paradox. One would think that the role of science, not only within the silo of science, is to foster understanding, to then guide our beliefs, but in fact it seems to be the opposite. The paradox lies in the fact that belief colors much of our understanding, inclusive of what we want to believe about the power of science and technology. Now, granted, within the ivory tower, if you will, within the sort of the rigorous methodological silo of science, there are those who push back very strongly and go, we're not ready there yet. We're not there. That's not what this does. Social pull is huge in a variety of different ways. Economically, legally, politically, and simply socially by virtue of the fact that these are tools that are available for us. What can you do with them? What can you do is not the same as what should you do. And of course, one of the things that goes along with this is the idea of a builder's bias. If some of these things are funded to be developed in particular ways, then the bias goes along with that and says, that's what we funded you to do. This is how we funded you to use this stuff. I hope that what you've seen up to this point and what may be happening to you as I've been describing this is this. You're sort of flip-flopping. It's a good thing, it's a bad thing. It's a good thing, it's a bad thing. Some of you are nodding away going, yeah. The young lady in the front is going, no, no. Each and every one of these things taken individually and together is both of these together. It reflects, in fact, our utopian expectations and aspirations. It says, yes, we can use neuroscience and neurotechnology to gain insight to the human person, the human being, human behavior, cognitions, emotions, and in so doing, divert, prevent those things that are going to be harmful to ourselves, our families, our loved ones, and in such a way, use this to enhance human flourishing and stabilize social relationships. At the exact same time, those exact same words can be interpreted and construed as, this is dystopia. This is Brave New World, Big Brother, all in one. That those things that cause us to demand our protection also may threaten our privacy. And those things that provide us with our safeties may also then cast upon us stigma. This then gets us to these prudential questions that define the landscape of the field that I spend so much of my time working with. Neuroethics and its sort of larger construal NELSI, neuroethical, legal, and social issues. And there are two primary questions that guide this field. Number one, of all the things that we can do, and I've spent the past hour and odd change describing them to you, what should be done with the things we have and the knowledge we possess, and what should be done about the things we lack and the knowledge that avoids. One of the things I rally strongly is to avoid this Icarus folly, false hubris, in two ways. False hubris in terms of the misrepresentation of what the neuroscience and technology can actually do. I can build wings and I can fly to the sun, Dad. Well, is it a technological failure or is it a failure of persona? The other part of Icarus folly is not just that the technology can't really do all that, but that we believe that it can and engage it to do those things. Despite Daedalus' warnings, Icarus said, yes, I can do this. Icarus folly is twofold. Number one, misappropriation, miscommunication, misunderstanding of the capabilities and limitations of the science and technology. And number two, misappropriation, miscommunication, and misunderstanding of false hubris about what we're able to do in terms of parsing out the tools we have and how we can and should use them. And this gets me to this point. The idea that neuroscience and neurotechnology convey tremendous capabilities of knowledge and engagement. To paraphrase Goethe and to paraphrase Nietzsche, with great knowledge comes great power. With great power comes tremendous responsibility. It's the proverbial Faustian Tale. Yes, Dr. Faustus, you'll get tremendous capability of knowledge, but are you ready for that? The sort of Jack Nicholson character. Are you ready for the truth? And the truth may be that you can't handle this yet. How then do we proceed forward? Well, here's what's not to do. We simply can't sort of play three monkeys and put our hands over our ears, our eyes, our mouth, and say we should do nothing. For a very simple reason, that this technology and this science is advancing at a rapid pace. Internationally, globally. At the same time, we're recognizing a need to mitigate what appears to be a somewhat growing problem, or at least a social awareness of this growing problem. And this then gets us to the interface where the rubber hits the road, neuroethics and practice. Three major issues. Number one, recognition and consideration of what is known about the brain, how we know it, and what we do with the information. And I must tell you, as a neuroscientist, I've been in the field of neuroscience for 30-odd years, the proverbial hard questions still remain. We simply do not know how mind occurs in brain. So virtually all of these approaches to understanding these larger issues of emotion, cognition, and behavior remain tentative, contingent, and speculative. Again, this feeds back into the mechanistic paradox. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't go there. It simply means that we must bear this ahead as the mantra by saying, well, There are some things we just don't know. What will we do about those things? That's the acknowledgement and appreciation of what we really have, what I like to refer to as the epistemological capital we actually have in the bank, which then brings us to this point, which is that we shouldn't be writing checks with capital we don't have, because that brings us to a point of default. What are the neuroethical concerns that are fostered by and arise from these trajectories of possible use and perhaps inapt use, if not frank misuse of neuroscientific techniques and technologies? These. Number one, this is brand new science and technology. Neuroscience moves ahead at about a 2 to 5 year interval of revision of whole bodies of knowledge about the way we understand the brain works. I've been in the field 30 years. I've seen major revisions in what I would call the groundwork of neuroscientific theory and neuroscientific understanding. In many ways, what I learned in graduate school was wrong and had to be revised. We have to keep pace with contemporary knowledge of neuroscience, and we understand that any science and technology that is built upon this is incipient. And as a result, there are two things we need to appreciate. Number one is a runaway effect. We think the science and technology, these techniques, are doing particular things, and then literally they get away from us. They're out of our control because we didn't understand the mechanisms that are going on in the brain or how these particular techniques or technologies interact with, affect, face these things. The other is this issue called a Wechselblatt effect, which is a nice way of saying an unanticipated consequence. A simpler way of saying it is that nature has a really funky sense of humor. I'm interacting with things on this level, and I say, well, this is a domino that needs to go down. We should do this. We should look at this and intervene here. And what I don't realize is that by messing with this domino, clack, 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 all these other dominoes go down as well. Why? Because I didn't see the potential burdens and risks until I dropped this domino. And then they come running up explosively to bite me in the fanny. The other thing that's very important for us is just because we develop the technology and use it in ways that are technically appropriate, in other words, we're not misusing the technology per se. We're using brain scanning for brain scanning. We're using EEG for recording of electrical and magnetic potentials. We're using genomics the way they're supposed to be used. That doesn't necessarily mean those things are morally sound. Technical rectitude is not the same as moral soundness and ethical and legal soundness. There are plenty of things that we can use correctly. For example, a gun. You hold it this way, not this way. You don't just pull the barrel, you pull the trigger. I'm using the gun correctly. But if I'm aiming that gun at someone who's done absolutely nothing to me, and I go and I blow their head off, correct use of the tool does not mean that I've used it in a way that is morally sound and ethically or legally good. The same is true here. And that gets us to these other two dimensions of technical rectitude confronting with moral gravitas. In some cases, it's just fumbling in my hands, inapt use, not using the thing in the right way. And in some cases, it's just using these things for malevolent ends. And understand, malevolence is relevant and highly relative. And this gets into these questions with regard to the ethical, legal, and social issues that arise from the use of neuroscientific techniques and technologies. Questions such as the legal validity and value of these techniques in courts of law as assessment. In the United States, there are two primary criteria that we use to evaluate new techniques of science and technology. One is called a Frye standard, which deals primarily with relevance, and then the other is a Daubert standard, which really deals with the issue of reliability. We've been advocating more of a Daubert reliance, but the other issue here is these are US legal codes. These things are being used, for example, more internationally. We perhaps need a much larger discourse on this area called neurolaw. My colleague Henry Greeley, for example, out at the University of Stanford University in California, is heading up a US national agenda on neurolaw, and there's a wonderful program at the University of Bonn that deals with this explicitly. How are we using neuroscience and technology to demonstrate capability, culpability, and do we really have the capability to do that, or are we lacking and we're sort of taking a literal leap of faith? And the last time we did that in a court of law, by the way, was the Inquisition, so we need to be very careful with that. Then, of course, we have to take a look at how we're defining these behaviors, cognitions, brain states to begin with. Are we saying, well, it might be a question of, well, this is what's good and this is what's not? Well, good for whom? Where? If one of the things we may be demonstrating is that what we have in common are individual differences, well, then how do we say where a norm is? Should people in the United States, for example, have a particular type of brain activity? And if you don't, should we be able to make that to you when you come across sort of immigration? Step through the scanner, please. Step through the MRI. And the next, please step through the transcranial magnetic stimulator. Because, when in Rome, science fiction, yes, absolutely, but not totally. Because you also have to remember the use of such things as psychosurgery and the increasing capability of these neurotechnologies not only to assess, but to access, to target, and manipulate. Which then comes to the idea of, if we're going to use them in certain ways, how informed can individuals be if they say, yes, I consent to having my brain scanned, I consent to having my neurogenome assessed, analyzed, and being fed into a large data bank? Because what that may then do is that may create this thing that our group has referred to as neuroontologies. Norming. This is what a normal brain looks like. Anything outside of this little distribution is abnormal. And what we do with the abnormal is either treat them or in some way segregate them from our population or target them as being a viable risk. I'm not saying that's necessarily wrong to do because there is a predictive and protective factor. It just has to be done in a way that is technically correct to the point of being able to be ethical, legally justifiable. Those two things must align. We cannot make an ethical legal justification based upon inapt use or inappropriate use or insufficient sophistication of the technology. Because ultimately, what this is feeding into is that individuals are going to get punished for this. If what we're really using this for is to target particular individuals as having high risk for a population and intervening in some way, it may be a therapeutic intervention. These individuals need to be counseled. These individuals need to be medicated. These individuals need to have a surgical intervention. These individuals need to be segregated, sequestered, quarantined from our population. This is still an aspect of retributive justice. And in fact, it's what's referred to as pre-retributive justice, because in some cases, the crime has not yet been committed, which is the whole purpose of the plea, do something. After the fact is easy, before the fact is rough. Now, before you say this will never happen, please understand that there is precedent for this. The precedent at present exists in the area of internet porn. The idea of an individual being apprehended for having internet pornography rests upon the implication, the legal implication, that this is an individual who has a high probability for molesting minors. And it proves as potential grounds for, at very, very least, arrest, and in some cases, incarceration. Precedent exists. Older precedent, although we have disbanded this across the United States, exists in falsifying a medical condition based upon a false view of what we know. This is called drapetomania. Drapetomania existed from the 1850s right up until the 1970s that suggested that it was a medical condition of individuals of color to be pathologically sloth, want to escape, free themselves from any condition whereby they'd have to interact within sort of social constructs, and this was then used as the marching orders to be able to then segregate individuals of color. It was a medical condition that was in fact validated by inappropriate, inapt use of biology. I urge that a precautionary principle is not enough for a number of different reasons. First and foremost, it's anachronistic. A precautionary principle, a Vorsichtsprinzip, if you will, was developed at a period of time when the trajectory between concept and real construct in practice was between 25 and 50 years. One could afford to take their time and go slowly. Moreover, what we understood is that there was a relatively constrained number of individuals who were capable of generating new science and new technology. And as a result, there was a pretty good umbra of protection that could be leveraged. These days, absolutely not. This kind of science and technology, widely available, widely usable, and not just by nation states, but also by individual actors. Moreover, its bastardization, its exploitation outside of the realm of technical rectitude is fairly high. Even in the United States, for example, there have been attempts, and still are, to utilize functional MRI as a form of lie detection in courts of law, which has gotten a great pushback from the neuroscience community, but has gained some increasing validity with regard to its appreciation by areas of the legal or social community. So what we see here is a misalignment. The other thing is that the burdens and the risks are always going to outweigh the benefits. Why? Because the benefits are right here in front of my nose. I designed the thing for its benefits. It's only after I've let the cat out of the bag that I realize that the cute little kitty who's wonderfully striped and purrs so nicely has claws, teeth, and poops on the rug. Cat's got to be out of the bag for a while. Point number 2, just because I let the cat out of the bag and I'm using kitty in the right way doesn't mean that somebody else out there is going to misuse that kitty, and very often they will. So what we see is that what this then disavows is that the status quo is progress. Progress occurs. This pendulum swing is dynamic, huge. I can't stand in the middle of that railroad track and go stop, nor should I. Because failing to appropriate the viable science and technology simply runs me over. And now all I'm doing is standing on the track, beat up and looking at somebody's caboose. Not necessarily a position I want to be in. But also, a frank precautionary principle is very difficult to apply. Why? Because the issue here is that if we don't engage this work, at least in part, somebody else will. And this then leverages tremendous economic, biotechnological, and political power. So there's a balance that needs to be done here. And part of this is that it doesn't account for something called Spengler effects. And what Spengler effects are is that science and technology changes society, and if you don't change society with it, you're screwed. So what should we do? Here's what I advocate. A little Dewey in deliberation, a little Arendt in action. The whole Dewey-esque approach is one of we got to be pragmatic. What does the technology really do? What does it not really do? We really have to get into an idea of understanding that. And it compels recognition of the strengths and limits, not only of the science and the technology, but also of we and the society who use it. If we really want to fix this, this is not just a lens that looks at the science and technology, but we need to turn this around as a mirror that looks at us. The existentialist philosopher Hannah Arendt was studying human cruelty. You may be aware of some of her more famous work in which she focused her studies on the convicted war criminal Adolf Eichmann. And she went to Jerusalem to see his trial and was really expecting to see a monster sitting before her. That's not what she saw. She saw a humble, opportunistic, middle-level bureaucrat who, in doing their job as a careerist, wearing a uniform, was signing numbers in a way that was efficient, and every one of those numbers represented a human life. She referred to that as the banality of evil. And what Arendt advocated was that we must stop, given the huge scientific, technological, and tremendous social power we now have at our hands, to affect millions of others with a single stroke of our pen. We can no longer simply slave away like animals with our head down, and then one day our creation comes up and bites us in the fanny, which she considered to be animal laborans, but rather must embrace what we are, thinking, sentient humans, and be aware of the responsibilities that exist with those things we do, a condition she referred to as homo faber, the creative, ingenuous human who, in fact, takes a look in advance of what they're creating. How? Well, our group is looking at this idea, the idea of Q's and P's. Every question of neuroethics requires this. It requires programs dedicated not only to the science and technology and engineering, but with equivalent gravitas that looks at the ethical, legal, and social issues that may be sponsored, fostered, and arise from this science, technology, and engineering. It requires people, professionals, and certainly the public, to engage in pragmatic analyses, to engage a preparatory posture, and that preparatory posture then feeds into prudence in our decisions and our actions. But this can only occur, if there's policy to, number one, support it in terms of funding it, and there's policy to support its inaction in practice. It must establish these groundwork questions. I'll not read them because it's tedious. Basically, what do we know, what do we not? Do the ethical systems and laws that we have in place meet the challenge of evolving new technologies and what we can and cannot do, what we should and should not do? Or must we, in some cases, re-examine those ethical policies, stances, systems, and laws, and develop new ones, because those that we have in place are insufficient to meet the challenge? As the philosopher Fritz Jahr said in 1926, as science and technology evolve, philosophy, ethics, and law must evolve with it, lest it is left behind in a cloud of dust. 1926. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is the ongoing work of this field, neuroethics and NELSI. Indeed, what I've tried to show you over the past hour and change is what we can do is exceedingly provocative and very contentious. What we should do and how we should go about doing it or not go about doing it, this remains an issue. This is the mantra of neuroethics: reflection, insight, analysis. Ethical legal consideration must precede and accompany each and every act of our scientific and technological innovation in the brain sciences. And indeed, this is critical. Why? If we are going to take neuroscience and neurotechnology and we're going to apply a viable ethics that not only appreciates the present, but faces the future, then the task at hand is onerous. My father was an engineer. When I was a little kid, one of the things he used to do is he and I used to engage in sort of model building and building stuff. It's something I still like to do very much. I like to build things, restore cars, airplanes. When I was a little kid, you know, my sort of pre-adolescent enthusiasm would sort of get the best of me, and I want to get in there and kind of use the things that I had, use the tools, and sort of make stuff. And sometimes it didn't work. Neuroscience is in its pre-adolescent phase. Neuroethics younger still. My father used to bounce me on his knee. He used to say, Jim, measure twice, cut once. Sometimes there's no turning back. Indeed, if in fact this is the case and we're going to actually face the future, my father would have made a wonderful neuroethicist. This future, ladies and gentlemen, is in our hands. My advice is it's up to us not to drop it. Hope you've enjoyed that. My work is ongoing and sponsored by a number of folks. If you want to get in touch with me, that's where. Thank you very much. And we've got some time for questions. Yes, ma'am. The question was in a very sort of non-scientific way, nature or nurture. The answer is yes, nature via nurture. Nature establishes essentially a blueprint, a foundation, which through ongoing interaction via nurturing different forms of internal and external environments across the lifespan determine relative extent and expression of that naturalistic blueprint. Here and here. Yes, sir.
Two questions, if I may. One is, at least now and perhaps for the foreseeable future, in order to get data from brains, as you described, it requires proximity, it requires time, and it requires often some sort of injected agent or something like that. So at least for the time being, it seems as if there'll be some safety measures of logistics. We're not going to be able to run around and get that data without consent and so on. So that was one question. The second one is somewhat facetious, but you mentioned sort of a genotype party, where what's your genotype instead of what's your sign,
right.
Astrology.
Right.
And of course, we probably all know people that have mixed up their genotypes and have wonderful results, but it sounded almost like they were only looking for the same or something. What was your follow-up on that?
Two questions. One was there seems to be a tremendous limitation to many of these neurotechnological and neuroscientific techniques by virtue of what's called a proximity factor. And that's quite true. The proximity factor is I have to put you in a scanner. I have to put a bunch of electrodes on your head. You may not sit still for this. And moreover, one of the things we understand is that some individuals, as with polygraph, are capable of faking good or faking bad. Although that's getting much harder to do given the current iterations of the technology we have at hand and the computational programs that are able to match those to existing databases. However, remember the technogram that I put up with all the little blue dots? Right? One of the things that same technogram can be used to do is play fill in the blanks. So we may not have certain data, but we have other data from certain domains that we can then feed into what's called data archetypes. In other words, I have a brain image that I took of you, and I can make particular predictions about what that brain image tells me, not only about that point in time, but how that particular anatomy and some of that physiology may lead to certain vulnerabilities that I then couple to other data. And as a consequence of that, I create a differential weighting within the technogram. So what we're able to do is, in some cases, partially compensate, for the absence of proximity of getting somebody in a scanner here and now to use existing data to make particular predictive or referent comparison values that may have some weight, ethical, legally, and socially. Is that appropriate to do? I would argue no, because the level of variation is broad enough that obviously if you're then using this as some form of intervention, that may be weak. Again, there are precedents, however, for that. The one we spoke about with regard to use of the internet stands as one of the glaring issues that comes up over and over again. The other issue that implicitly is in what you've said is how much data do we need to be able to fortify an ethical, legally sound decision to intervene? That is an ongoing question. It's some of the work that my colleague Fabrice Jotarand and I are working on right now through the idea of a viable metric that provides a flexible and applicable system that can be used not only within cultures but across cultures that then interfaces with sort of a larger agenda that's being worked upon by a fellow named Vito Antonio Amodio, which is the idea of ethnopsychiatry. So you have to fit these things together. That then goes to your next question, which is, well, what are we really doing with these genomics, genetics, and proteomics? And is this not sort of identifying some kind of a sameness? It's actually just the opposite. one of the things we notice is that, although we like to say that opposites attract, in many of the superficial opposites, yes, indeed, they do attract, but they don't last. But there are certain biological opposites that are important to sort of bring together, because what they create is something called hybrid vigor. And part of the whole agenda is to determine what characteristics biologically are important to mix with other characteristics to be able to generate this hybrid vigor. And what that then does is sort of create sort of a new instantiation of what health and norm may be. Now, that teeters precariously on what's science fiction and what's science fact. We look at this science factually within the neuroscience of psychiatric and neurological disorders, as well as others, to be able to determine, well, these represent viable combinations that may be predictive of, and in some cases, prophylactic against certain disease states, conditions, etc. And what we might then want to do is intervene. This is not new either. This was the big uproar, as you may know, in the deaf community with regard to particular types of genetically encoded hearing loss that were then targeted for particular federal mandates, AB 2702, the UK Fertilization Embryology Act, that were actually seeking in some ways to create a politically motivated form of quasi-eugenics to eradicate a genome in the population because it represented a socially viable disability that could be fixed. The uproar with regard to existential loss and gain, not only from the deaf community, but for a number of different communities, was overwhelming. However, this is not new. And so, once again, we have to be very careful in terms of Icarus folly twofold to be able to mitigate exactly the effects that you're leading us into. Yes, sir.
We have a very long history of science overpromising and the legal system relying on that and making some horrible decisions, all the way back to 3 generations of imbeciles is enough, to forced lobotomies for people whose behavior was antisocial. How do we know that all the things that you're showing now aren't going to be overpromised and over-abused in the same ways?
We don't. And that, as far as I'm concerned, is both the fear and the caveat. I find that it's very, very important to look to the historicity of science and technology to begin to develop what I call a canon for neuroethics and neuroethical, legal, and social issues. You know, we love to sort of point our finger and say, oh, those nasty Nazis. You know, wait, let's not forget that eugenics was not a Nazi idea. The whole idea of utilizing public health as a viable police force for the medical integrity of the state actually arose in the UK and was very, very popular here in the United States. The idea of 3 generations of imbeciles, that's not Germano speak. That's Americano speak. You bet it is. And let's not forget the involvement of folks like Galton, Pearson, English types who were looking statistically at trying to increase human flourishing and alleviate the burden of disability both economically and socially. And it links back to a sort of quasi-Malthusian effect that said, well, how do we actually move forward? We have to prune or cull the population in ways that are, quote, viable. Could this fall victim to same? Absolutely. And that then represents the whole idea of Icarus folly. I'm only looking this way. I need not look backwards. Yes, of course you need to look backwards. And it's not just enough to sort of point overseas and go ni vida. It's important to turn that lens into a mirror and make sure the mistakes are not made, albeit contextually differently, with the latest and greatest science and technology to misappropriate what it can do. Your point is spot on. Question in the back first.
Yeah, you're advocating caution as we move forward, and you're also quoting how the rate of knowledge is increasing so rapidly. And you talk about physiological intervention a couple of times. I wonder what your thinking is in regards to Ray Kurzweil's singularity and his, you're familiar with that. And,
yes.
I mean, do you regard that as a real threat to being able to act cautiously?
I don't. I mean, you know, one has to sort of, and again here, I don't mean to throw at Kurzweil, sort of all of Kurzweil's work as sort of baby bathwater. I don't. The idea of a sort of a viable singularity in the way that it was actually described by Kurzweil, I think, is something that combines some factual information with a bit of sort of fictional expectation and anxiety. I think the idea of being able to have convergent science, the integrative scientific convergence, is in fact very, very real and renders a tremendous amount of power. Power always is a two-sided blade. One need only look at the philosophical work of Michel Foucault, for example, to recognize, particularly when you're dealing with biological issues, that biopower can be utilized by body politic as biopolitics, and that becomes devastating, number one. Number two, the whole concept of sort of a unified singularity, which may seem oxymoronic or sort of the naval school of redundancy school, it's not. That type of a singularity, I think, may be an overestimation of what the scientific trajectory really may be. However, the idea of consilience, the idea of convergence within particular disciplines that become de-siloed, that then wage significant amount of potential promise and problematic, as one would say sort of reflective of the writing about the singularity, I think is important. So I view Kurzweil's work as, although based upon a hypothetical or in some cases fictional extrapolation of what our scientific fact is, equally stands as a good warning emblem for us to regard particular domains of scientific convergence with the same level of apprehension, caution, and preparedness. Yes, ma'am.
You talked about how all these are measurements of indirect measurements of brain activity or brain response. And I think you mentioned a little bit, but do we know what would be a direct measurement, and we just cannot get to it, or we don't even know what is actually brain activity at all? And given that these are indirect, how valid are the predictions that we're basing?
Well, I'll take your last question first, because I think your last question first, how valid are the predictions, really reflects the entire scope and tenor of the lecture. They're inferential predictions. And as long as we keep that in mind and use that as sort of the tempo by which we march ahead and recognize that is the beat of the drummer we are marching to, I think that's okay. Because what that allows us to do is to be scrupulous, to have a sense of scrutiny, and in some cases pessimistic skepticism of what we're really doing, and weigh this in what's called a casuistic approach. In other words, weigh each and every case based upon what we know and try to develop a corpus of paradigmatic cases to be able to then create, well, this may be precedent. Okay. The other issue is, well, how direct of a measure do we have of the brain? And my answer to that question is, I don't know. I think what we're doing is we're getting tangentially closer, and there are some real problems with this, and this is what we refer to in neurophilosophy as the Teufelskreis, which is the devil's circle. Let me just sort of aside for a little bit, and this is where I put you all to sleep. I'm a systems neuroscientist, and one of the sort of the doctrines of systems theory is you really can't understand the whole unless you understand the parts, but you cannot understand the parts unless you understand the whole. Right now, neuroscience is really struggling with that, trying to understand parts in a way that is not just materialistically reductive, but do so in a way that is intertheoretical reductive or intertheoretically translatable, and understand the notion of systems embedded in systems. This is a large agenda, and I think one of the things it does is provides for us a very good glimpse onto where neuroscience is going and needs to go within its next 5 to 10 year sort of extrapolation of effect and articulation. Right now, the most current view, theory, is that we're looking at a complex dynamical system that exists within sort of an n-dimensional space, the brain, that is able to do particular things and exerts or creates particular properties that we view right now as emergent, simply because we cannot define, in Aristotelian terms, the effective cause of how brain does consciousness. We haven't done that. As an aside, this is what I call a sort of swilling my bourbon and talking to you on the side. I think we're probably not going to do that in a biological system. I think we'll gain at least a leg up on understanding that by virtue of a non-biological system that we create that actually evokes conscious function, and we get a eureka moment, not unlike, for example, certain things that happened with flight. We studied the biological system for a long time, flapping wings, and then it was only through an application of fluid dynamics and creating an airfoil that we take a look at the work of Otto Lilienthal and then subsequently the Wright brothers, and we develop aerodynamics. So I think some of our machine engineering might give rise to a better understanding of how a physical substrate might evoke, channel, generate this thing called consciousness, but we're not there yet. So as a result, what we're doing is we're sort of always kind of looking in sort of a Platonic Socratic view at the shadows on the wall and not necessarily at the actual figures themselves. Getting closer, but that's where we are. Here, yes.
I've noticed that in a lot of both the social and political things, there seems to be an unexamined assumption that non-normative equals less.
Right. Yes and no. It really depends. You know, you have to sort of look at the Gaussian curve or any kind of distribution, and you have there's the degrees of freedom on both sides. What tends to happen is people focus on one side of degrees of freedom sort of less than the mean. They tend not to sort of look at the other way and sort of say non-normative, those things that fall less, and those things that fall over, well, we sort of categorize that somewhat unadroitly as being okay. The other issue is that things that sort of fall outside the norm very often are part of this whole construct of what we call biological diversity. And biological diversification essentially establishes a vigor that is important for nonlinear adaptability.
Today's disability is tomorrow's superability.
Exactly right. And so one of the things that becomes very important is, again, as the epistemological capital grows, we must use that scientific epistemological capital to then leverage moral regard, social treatment, etc., and revise these philosophical constructs, ethical, legal constructs, political constructs accordingly. The issue then becomes you don't want to usurp them or bastardize them because that's difficult to do in the political arena. It happens all the time. Once you do that, that becomes a very difficult sort of Gordian knot to untangle. One need only take a look, for example, at the eugenics movement, the whole idea of the Hadamard program and the whole notion of sort of racial impropriety and the pseudo-social Darwinian approaches that were used in Hitler's Germany. So one of the things that is important, I think, for contemporary neuroscience and certainly neuroethics to do is to redefine and redescribe the idea of multiple tiers of norm as based upon ecological functionality that then represent diversities. That's critical. That's some of the work we're doing at Gallaudet, for example. So, I mean, if you're interested, we can certainly talk about that a bit more offline, but you've raised a very, very good point. Off-norm does not mean less than, nor does it mean off-norm means inferior to.
And not every norm can be mapped to a simple scalar.
You're absolutely right. Again, that's why we didn't have a whole lot of time, but the reason I put the spectrum effect on the board for you is that every one of those points on that curve of spectrum effect actually represent both a point and a halo. And they represent multiple assembled Gaussian distributions that have very, very different characteristics. And so what you're really looking at is normality doesn't exist as this or this. We have to try to understand what that really means relative to linearity and nonlinearity of a set of aggregate traits and characteristics relative to the embedded individual that is embodied. That's a bigger marching order. That's a systems within systems approach to trying to redefine tiered levels of norms and different levels of functionality that may be highly, highly functional, but exist outside one type of norm within another. And that's huge. The work of Teresa Blake, actually it's Teresa Blankmeyer Burke, at Gallaudet is something you should look into because obviously that speaks very, very strongly to a number of issues of neurodiversity as it relates to both biological phenomenon and social phenomenon. Let's take here.
This would be one more, I guess, for us.
Let's take two because the gentleman in the back has been like waving his hand vociferously. And yes, sir.
Well, I was excited when you talked about the social pull. And I'll give you the example of my father's company. He was in sales and marketing. And they actually use things like handwriting analysis to promote people and to hire people.
Sure.
Just horrifying to me. And most of us in the skeptical community have a particularly skeptical view of the polygraph. And huge government agencies using that to screen people before they can ever get in as employees. It's just astonishing stuff. So those are examples of huge amounts of the pull is the hiring moment, or maybe the enlisting of a volunteer into a military unit.
You used a good phrase.
Is there anything else to compare to that?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
But that's a huge pull right there.
Yeah, but you used a good phrase. You said the hiring moment. And of course, moment is a function of arm. So I'll sort of revert this back down to sort of physical terms. The longer the arm, right, the more you change the moment. And so what we see here is that neuroscience right now has a growing arm, and as a result, the moment forces, the tipping action of neuroscience to gain that leverage, when people call for do something, very often is going to be influential. The question is there significant enough solidarity within the neuroscientific and neuroethical community to be able to plot a course forward, recognizing that there are potential benefits of these neuroscientific techniques and technologies, but resisting the social pull to inapt use in the ways that you've just described, certainly things like hiring, et cetera, but even more than that. I mean, much of these data that I described to you here can be used in a way that is not only stigmatizing, but very preventive of not just things like social aggression and violence, but who gets insurance, who does not, who gets particular jobs, who does not, who is let into particular schools, communities, and who is not, and who is sort of the haves versus the have-nots, ultimately in terms of who gets treated, who gets enabled, who gets enhanced, and what do we do that those that simply don't fall into that realm of distributive justice. So the issue here, which is why I always refer back to what's called NELSI, neuroethical, legal, and social issues, is the social pull that very often is very important, beating on the door of neuroscience with two different knockers. The first is, you must do something, and the second is, don't use that this way. How do you answer that door? And the only way you answer that door is, you better have your house in order when you open up that door. Question in the back.
You referred a few times to the extreme examples of mass murders. And if we expand the aperture a little bit, we have an interesting social experiment going on with athletics. So people who routinely sustain head trauma, subconcussive events, football, boxing, those people tend to, at least anecdotally, have high risk of depression and sometimes suicide. What would happen if we took either those criminals or those athletes and, with the best to our technology right now, infer what's going on in their brains? What do we see? Can we actually see those outcomes before they occur?
So you didn't really open a Pandora's box, but you sort of opened a little like a Pandora's necklace. So one of the things that we've been trying to do the past couple of years is really look at the whole notion of head injury as spectrum disorder. Really brain injury, inclusive of things like predispositions for aneurysm, stroke, concussive injury, and then long-standing traumatic brain injury subsequent to not just concussion, but electromagnetic pulse injury, shear injury, a variety of pressure dynamic forces. And one of the things we're looking at is there a predispositional genome, genotype, or phenotype that these individuals express that can take them in one of a variety of directions that could lead to just these types of things? And are there biomarkers for that? So that this is an individual, we may say, you have a much higher predisposition towards this type of brain injury. Let's keep this person out of harm's way or try to provide at least some prophylactic or mitigating measures. So some of the work we're doing, for example, with the folks up at Nazareth Hospital in Pennsylvania, are really dedicated to that exact project. It was funded in part by the Office of Naval Research and Bureau of Medicine and Surgery to examine the preponderance of shifts in things like the incidence and then prevalence of longitudinal neuropsychiatric sequelae after head injury, even of individuals who didn't appear to sustain any profound head injury at the time. So looking at a variety of different etiologies and how those potential etiologies may then engage the existing phenotype, genotype, et cetera. So in other words, there may be numbers of different types of houses of cards. And one thing knocks down the house of cards one way, the other knocks down the house of cards another way at a different card, but the ultimate result is going to be the same, which is this constellation of features that we see as part of this neuropsychiatric spectrum, some of the work that my colleague Rachel Vertzman and I are doing. So if that's something that interests you, I refer you to the website. You can gain more information. Feel free to contact me. The issue then becomes, where do you intervene? What can you do? And of the things you can do, what should you actually do, and how can you do it based upon some of the social, political, or administrative infrastructures that are in place? And might we need something of a sea change? So it's a good question. With that, I guess that's the end of our questions. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.